It was just another ordinary afternoon in the quiet streets of Los Angeles. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the city. People were finishing up their day, some headed home after work, others out for an evening stroll. But in the middle of this calm, a certain cat was about to experience something that would change its life forever. Whiskers, a sleek black cat with glowing green eyes, was enjoying the freedom of the outdoors, as she often did. She had spent hours exploring the neighborhood, weaving through the alleyways, and occasionally stopping to bask in the patches of sunlight that peeked through the trees. For Whiskers, the world was her playground, full of new scents and interesting corners to explore. But today, the universe had other plans. As Whiskers padded along the curb, a loud roar of a motorcycle broke the silence. Jake, a burly biker with a reputation for being ruthless, revved his engine as he sped down the street on his custom Harley-Davidson. His leather jacket flapped in the wind, and his tattoos, proudly displayed on his arms, seemed to tell a story of a man who never cared much for consequences. Today, however, he was in a particularly bad mood, and his reckless attitude was about to collide with Whiskers' peaceful afternoon. Without warning, Jake swerved his bike to the side, just missing the group of pedestrians on the sidewalk. Laughing under his breath, he kicked out his boot with a vicious force. Whiskers, who had been minding her own business, suddenly felt a sharp pain as the boot connected with her side. She was thrown off balance, tumbling across the pavement in an instant. Jake didn't stop. He didn't even look back. The sound of his engine faded into the distance as if the incident had never happened. Whiskers, dazed and disoriented, lay still on the ground. Her breathing was shallow, and she could feel the sting in her ribs. The peaceful world she had known just moments ago was now filled with pain and confusion. And for Jake, it was just another laugh, another fleeting moment of amusement. He had no idea that this simple act of cruelty was about to set off a chain of events that would lead him down a path he never imagined. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake's life was anything but ordinary. The leather jacket he wore was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of the life he had chosen, a life that didn't care for rules or consequences. With a face covered in stubble and a pair of piercing blue eyes, Jake had the kind of look that made people steer clear. His reputation in the underground biker world was well-earned. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ability to get what he wanted, and his utter disregard for anyone or anything that stood in his way. Born and raised in a small town in Nevada, Jake had learned early on that life wasn't fair. His father had been a drunk, his mother had left when he was young, and he had been forced to fend for himself from a tender age. At 16, he had dropped out of high school and hit the road, working odd jobs here and there, never staying in one place too long. He had found a family in the biker gangs, a place where the rules of society didn't apply. They had taken him in, given him a sense of belonging in a world where he felt invisible. But while Jake had found his place, he had also found his demons. Alcohol, drugs, and violent confrontations had become his coping mechanisms. He had built walls around his heart, making it nearly impossible for anyone to get close to him. He had learned that the only thing that mattered in life was power and control, and he had done whatever it took to maintain that. As Jake zoomed down the streets of LA, he didn't think about the cat he had just kicked. It wasn't something that lingered in his mind for more than a few seconds. To him, it was just a game, a way to blow off steam. People and animals alike were just obstacles in his way, things that he could brush off without a second thought. The world was his to conquer, and if anything stood in his path, it was fair game. Jake had a few regular stops he made on his rides around the city. The bar down the street was one of them, his home away from home, the place where he could relax, kick back, and forget about the chaos of his life for a while. It was the type of place where people didn't ask too many questions, where the noise of the jukebox and the clinking of beer bottles drowned out the harsh realities of the outside world. Pulling up in front of the bar, Jake parked his bike, the sound of its engine still echoing in the streets long after it had stopped. He tossed his helmet to the side and walked inside, the familiar scent of stale beer and tobacco filling the air. "Hey, Jake," called out Frank, the bartender. "The usual?" Jake gave a nod, sliding onto one of the stools at the bar. He wasn't in the mood for conversation, not tonight. His mind was occupied with the thoughts of the ride, the thrill of the engine roaring beneath him. But his moment of peace would soon be interrupted. As he took a sip of his beer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from one of his gang members. "Yo, heard you kicked a cat earlier. You out of your damn mind?" Jake's brow furrowed as he read the message. His hand tightened around the bottle of beer, the sudden spike of anger catching him off guard. He had done worse things, far worse, but something about this cat, was bothering him. The more he thought about it, the more his mind began to race. The thought of some innocent animal being hurt, for no reason at all, didn't sit right with him. He had always shrugged off his actions, always told himself that the world was tough, and people, hell, even animals, had to be tough too. But this felt different. There was something unsettling about it, like he had crossed a line he never intended to cross. He was snapped out of his thoughts when Frank slid a fresh drink in front of him. "Bad day?" Frank asked, noticing the frown on Jake's face. Jake shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. "Nah, just thinking about something," he mumbled, not sure if he even believed his own words. Jake didn't sleep much that night. The alcohol didn't dull the thoughts in his head like it usually did. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling of his dingy apartment, the faint hum of city traffic drifting through the window. No matter how many times he tried to convince himself that kicking a cat was just another careless mistake, the image of that small, defenseless creature kept flashing in his mind. The way it had collapsed, its tiny body battered by the force of his kick. For the first time in a long time, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The next morning, he woke up with a dull headache, still groggy from the alcohol. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake off the lingering guilt. But it was no use. He pulled on his leather jacket, grabbed his keys, and headed out the door, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. As he walked down the street, his mind still plagued by that damn cat, he spotted something in the distance. A figure standing at the edge of the sidewalk, looking down at something on the ground. It was Keanu Reeves. Jake recognized him instantly. Who wouldn't? Keanu was a local legend, not just because of his fame as an actor, but because he was known for his deep love of animals, especially cats. He had built a reputation over the years as someone who would do anything to protect his pets and, by extension, the community. Jake had heard whispers of Keanu's kindness, but he had never actually met the man. Jake hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he wanted to get anywhere near someone like Keanu, someone who embodied everything Jake was not. But something pulled him toward the scene, and he found himself walking over without thinking twice. Keanu didn't notice Jake at first, as he was kneeling beside Whiskers, who was lying on the pavement. The cat's fur was matted, and her breathing was shallow. Keanu's hand was gently placed on her side, his expression one of deep concern. It was clear to Jake that Keanu was completely focused on the little creature, completely unaware of his presence. "Is she going to be okay?" Jake asked, his voice low and uncertain. Keanu looked up, his face softening when he saw Jake standing there. There was a pause as Keanu took in the biker's appearance, Jake's rough demeanor, the tattoos, the leather jacket. But Keanu didn't seem fazed. He just nodded toward the cat. "She'll be okay," Keanu said, his voice calm, even soothing. "She's strong. She just needs some rest." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his actions hit him again, sharper this time. This man, this Hollywood icon, was kneeling on the street, caring for a cat he had no obligation to care for. Someone who didn't know anything to the world, yet still gave so much. Meanwhile, Jake had been nothing but cruel and careless. Keanu gently scooped Whiskers into his arms, cradling her with an ease that surprised Jake. The cat's eyes flickered open for a moment before closing again. It was clear that she was in pain, but she wasn't dead, and for some reason, that gave Jake a sense of relief. Keanu stood up, still holding Whiskers close to his chest, and looked at Jake. "You the one who kicked her?" Jake's throat tightened. For a second, he almost wanted to deny it, act like it wasn't him. But the guilt was too much. His shoulders slumped, and he nodded reluctantly. "I'm sorry," Jake said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. It wasn't like him to apologize, but he couldn't stand the thought of this man seeing him as nothing more than a heartless thug. I didn't mean to hurt her. It was stupid. I was messing around, and I didn't think. Keanu didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at Jake, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Keanu spoke. You don't hurt animals for fun. Ever. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, one that Jake couldn't ignore. And you don't get to just walk away from that. Not like it never happened. Jake swallowed hard. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by someone like Keanu. But he didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, feeling small for the first time in a long while. Keanu didn't seem angry, just disappointed. And that made it worse. Take responsibility for what you've done, Keanu continued. She's a living thing. She feels pain. You should try to make things right. Jake didn't know what to say. He'd spent so many years convincing himself that nothing mattered, that the world owed him nothing. But now, standing here in front of Keanu, the reality of his actions hit harder than a punch to the gut. Keanu took a deep breath, as if weighing something in his mind. You want to help? You can start by making sure she gets better. Jake didn't even hesitate this time. I'll take care of her, he said. I swear. And just like that, the journey to redemption began. Jake had never been one for second chances. He'd lived his whole life under the assumption that if you didn't take what you wanted when you could, it would slip away. But as he stood there, watching Keanu walk off with Whiskers cradled in his arms, something inside Jake began to shift. He had promised to make things right, but the question was, could he really change? Could a man like him, someone who had built his whole life on fear, power, and indifference, actually make amends for something like this? The sound of his motorcycle, parked a few feet away, seemed to mock him. He was a biker, a ruthless one at that. He wasn't supposed to care. But as the evening wore on, his mind kept returning to the image of Keanu, gently caring for Whiskers, his kind eyes focused entirely on the cat's well-being. The contrast between Keanu's calm and Jake's anger felt like a jarring wake-up call. As night fell, Jake found himself back at his apartment, pacing back and forth. He hadn't planned on this, any of it. He wasn't the kind of guy to apologize, to fix things. And yet, here he was, feeling a gnawing guilt that refused to let go. The apartment felt empty, like it always did. The walls, filled with posters of biker rallies and dusty trophies, offered no comfort. He threw his jacket onto the couch, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had lived like this for years, isolated and hardened. But today, that all felt different. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, expecting to see another message from one of the guys in his crew, but it was something else. A text from Keanu. Whiskers is resting. You don't need to do this alone. She'll be okay. But if you really want to help, show up tomorrow. 10 a.m. Be there. Jake stared at the screen for a moment, the weight of the message sinking in. Keanu wasn't just offering forgiveness. He was offering something more. A chance for Jake to prove that he could be more than the man he had been. Jake knew he wasn't ready for the challenge, but somehow, the thought of backing out felt worse than the idea of trying. The next morning, Jake found himself standing outside Keanu's house, his boots heavy on the concrete. He hadn't been up this early in years, especially not for something like this. But there he was, fighting every instinct that told him to turn around and run. Keanu's house was modest, tucked away from the city noise. It was a quiet neighborhood, and the yard was well kept, with flowers in full bloom. Whiskers, the little cat who had nearly been killed, was sitting on the porch, grooming herself, her eyes bright and alert. The sight of her made Jake's chest tighten. She was fine. But that didn't excuse what he'd done. Keanu appeared from inside the house, looking every bit the part of the calm, collected person he always seemed to be. He nodded toward Jake. You made it, Keanu said simply, as if Jake showing up was the most natural thing in the world. Jake didn't say anything at first. He was still trying to figure out what to say. Instead, he knelt down slowly, his movements cautious as he reached out to Whiskers. The cat eyed him with some hesitation but allowed him to pet her, her purring soft and steady. "You're doing the right thing," Keanu said, watching Jake interact with the cat. "You've got a long way to go, but it starts with moments like this." Jake glanced up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I don't know if I can make up for what I did," he muttered, his voice rough. Keanu shrugged, his expression still calm. "It's not about making up for it all at once. It's about showing that you're willing to try, willing to change." Jake stood up, taking a deep breath. He could feel the weight of his past tugging at him, but something in Keanu's words kept him grounded. For the next few hours, they worked together to care for Whiskers, who seemed to be doing much better. Keanu gave Jake pointers on how to handle the cat gently, how to check for any injuries he might have missed. It was simple work, but to Jake, it felt like the first step towards something real. As they finished up for the day, Keanu turned to Jake. "You did good today. Keep showing up, and you'll see the difference." Jake nodded, feeling something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was a strange sensation, one that made him uncomfortable, but it also made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption. Jake had never been one to stick around for anything. Whether it was relationships, jobs, or commitments, he was always on the move, always running from something. But for the first time in his life, he felt a strange pull to stay. He couldn't explain it, but after the last few days with Whiskers and Keanu, something inside him had shifted. Maybe it was the unexpected bond he felt with the cat, or the way Keanu's calm presence had begun to chip away at his defenses. Whatever it was, Jake found himself showing up at Keanu's house every day. Each morning, Jake would ride his bike over, never knowing exactly what the day would bring. But every day, without fail, Keanu was there, waiting with a steady, unwavering gaze. And every day, Whiskers seemed to get stronger, her injuries healing, her confidence returning. It felt good to be part of something that wasn't just about taking and leaving, but about giving and staying. One afternoon, as they were sitting on the porch, Keanu spoke up. "You know," Keanu began, "you're doing more than just helping Whiskers. You're learning how to help yourself." Jake glanced at him, unsure of what to say. The thought of changing his entire outlook on life was daunting, to say the least. He had spent so many years pushing people away, never letting anyone get too close. But now, with Keanu and the cat, it felt like maybe he could start a trust again. "I don't know if I can change that much," Jake admitted, his voice low. "I've been this way for so long, you know? I don't know how to just be different." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about becoming someone else. It's about being the person you were always meant to be. The one who doesn't hurt others to feel better about himself. The one who chooses to be better, even when it's hard." Jake's mind raced. He had heard those words before. People had tried to tell him he could be better, that he didn't have to live the way he had been living. But somehow, hearing them from Keanu felt different. Maybe it was because Keanu had a way of making everything feel possible. Maybe it was because Jake actually believed him. The next day, Jake showed up a little earlier than usual. He didn't come straight from the bar, where he normally went to drown out his thoughts. Instead, he went straight to Keanu's place. He felt a pull to do something, anything, to prove to himself that he could change. Keanu was working in his garden when Jake arrived. Whiskers was lounging in the sun, her body now strong and agile again. Jake walked over to Keanu, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You need help with that?" Jake asked, pointing to the garden tools lying on the ground. Keanu looked up, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Sure. Grab that rake." Jake picked it up and began raking the dirt, side by side with Keanu, as the afternoon sun bathed them in a warm glow. It was such a simple task, yet for some reason, it felt like the most meaningful thing he had done in years. The work was easy, the company was quiet, and the air around them was peaceful. Nothing like the chaos Jake had always been surrounded by. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Keanu spoke again. "You ever think about why you live the way you do?" Jake paused, the rake still in his hands, as he considered the question. He hadn't really thought about it like that. He had always just been this way. A fighter. A biker. Someone who lived on the edge because that's what he knew. "I guess I've just never had a reason to do anything different," Jake answered honestly. "I don't know what it's like to live any other way. I've always had to look out for myself." Keanu looked at him for a moment, his gaze steady and full of understanding. "You're not alone, Jake, and you don't have to keep fighting. There's more to life than survival. Sometimes it's about finding what really matters." Jake swallowed, feeling the weight of Keanu's words. It was a lot to process, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might just be ready to try. That evening, as Jake prepared to leave, Keanu stopped him. "Hey, if you want to stick around here for a while, we've got space. You don't have to do this alone. I think you're on the right path, but it's going to take more than just showing up every day." Jake looked at Keanu, surprised by the offer. He hadn't expected this, but for some reason, the thought of staying, of being part of something bigger than himself, didn't seem so scary anymore. "I'll think about it," Jake said quietly. It was a small promise, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger. As he rode off into the night, the wind rushing past him, Jake realized that he wasn't running away this time. He was riding towards something. He wasn't sure what it was, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like it might be worth finding out. The next few days felt like a strange kind of limbo for Jake. He had made a promise to Keanu, and now, it seemed that his world was shifting beneath him. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, being uncertain, feeling like he was on the edge of something new, but not knowing exactly what that was. Keanu's offer to stay had been simple but meaningful. The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized how little he had allowed himself to think about what he wanted. He'd always been a man of action, always riding from place to place, pushing people away, shutting everything down before it could get too close. But now, with Keanu and Whiskers, it felt like he was being forced to slow down and take a hard look at the life he had built. Jake didn't know if he was ready to make such a big change. He wasn't sure what would happen if he allowed himself to stay in one place, open himself up to the kind of life Keanu seemed to lead. But it wasn't just the unknown that bothered him, it was his past. His past was a weight he couldn't escape, no matter how far he ran. It was just a week later when Jake got the message. The text was short, blunt, and it hit him like a punch in the gut. "We need to talk. Your old crew's looking for you." Jake's heart sank as the words on the screen blurred in front of him. He didn't want to go back there. He didn't want to face the people he had once called family, but he knew he couldn't run from them forever. They had a way of pulling you back in, no matter how hard you tried to break free. Keanu had warned him. He'd known that Jake's past would eventually catch up with him, but Jake had hoped, just for a moment, that he could escape it. That maybe, just maybe, he could start over and build something different. But the truth was, the past always had a way of resurfacing. The next morning, Jake didn't go to Keanu's house. Instead, he spent the day pacing in his apartment, wrestling with the decision he didn't want to make. He couldn't just ignore the message. His old gang, the riders he had spent years with, the ones who had been there when no one else was, were still part of his life, whether he liked it or not. By late afternoon, Jake knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He pulled on his jacket and made his way to the old bar where his gang usually hung out. The place was dark and dingy, with a haze of smoke lingering in the air. It smelled of cheap beer and regret. As Jake stepped inside, the conversations died down, and a few of the guys looked up, their eyes narrowing as they saw him standing there. It had been almost a year since he'd last been here, but in this world, a year might as well have been a lifetime. These guys didn't forget, and they sure as hell didn't forgive. "Look what the cat dragged in," one of the bikers sneered, his voice thick with disdain. Jake didn't flinch. He had been through worse than this. He walked up to the bar, ordered a drink, and tried to ignore the tension swirling in the room. But he could feel their eyes on him, waiting for something. One of the men, a large figure named Sam, finally stood up and approached Jake. Sam was built like a brick wall, his face a permanent scowl. His presence alone was enough to make people back off, and Jake knew Sam's reputation well. Sam was the enforcer, the muscle, the one you called when things got ugly. "You think you can just disappear, Jake?" Sam growled, his voice low but filled with menace. "You walk away from this life, but it doesn't just let you go. You're either with us or you're against us. You can't have it both ways." Jake looked Sam dead in the eye, refusing to back down. I'm not with you anymore, Sam. I'm done with all of this. The words left his mouth before he even realized what he had said. For years, this gang had been his family, his protection, the only thing that had ever given him a sense of belonging. But now, he didn't want any part of it. It wasn't the life he wanted anymore. And for the first time, he felt something like hope. Hope that he could walk away from it and actually be okay. Sam's expression twisted into something darker, and for a moment, Jake thought he might be in trouble. But then, Sam just shook his head, almost disappointed. You think you can just walk away from the family, Jake? You think they'll let you go? You're not even close to done with us. Jake's heart raced, but he stood his ground. I'm done. I'm not that person anymore. For a long moment, there was silence. The other bikers exchanged glances, waiting for Sam's next move. But Sam just sneered and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Jake finished his drink, paying for it with the last of his cash. As he stepped out of the bar and into the cool night air, he felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. He had stood up to his past, but he knew it wouldn't be the last time he was confronted by it. The gang wouldn't just let him go. They'd be back. They always came back. But at that moment, Jake didn't feel defeated. He didn't feel like he had to run. Instead, he felt a spark of something new, something that had been growing inside of him since the day he first helped Keanu with Whiskers. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about living. And if he was going to truly change, he needed to face whatever came next with the same strength he had shown tonight. Jake didn't go back to Keanu's place right away. The conversation with his old crew was still ringing in his ears. It had been a wake-up call, but not the kind that made him want to run. No, this was different. His encounter with Sam and the others had ignited something in Jake that he hadn't felt in years: courage. A courage that wasn't about fighting, but about standing firm in the face of his past. He knew that the gang wouldn't forget about him anytime soon, and he wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't come after him again. But Jake had made a decision, and it wasn't just some fleeting thought. It was real. He was done with that life. He was done running, done hiding behind his tough exterior, done using violence as an answer. But there was something else, something deeper. Jake wasn't just done with the gang. He was done with the life of loneliness and isolation he'd built for himself. It had been easy for him to push everyone away, to keep people at arm's length so no one could hurt him. But he'd learned something over the last few weeks. The truth wasn't that people would hurt him. The truth was, he had been hurting himself all along by not letting anyone in. By the time he rode back to Keanu's house, the sun was dipping low in the sky. It was a quiet evening, the kind that felt peaceful but also full of weight. Keanu was sitting on the porch, as usual, Whiskers curled up in his lap. "Did you leave something behind?" Keanu asked as Jake approached, his voice casual but his eyes sharp, as if he already knew Jake had something to say. Jake paused for a moment before responding, looking down at the ground, trying to gather his thoughts. He hadn't planned on talking about what happened with his old crew, but somehow, he felt like Keanu was the person he needed to tell. The kind of person who wouldn't judge him or see him as weak for admitting the truth. "Yeah," Jake said, his voice quieter than usual. "Had a little run-in with some old friends." Keanu didn't ask for details. Instead, he just nodded, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Jake hesitated. "I don't know yet. I think I might be. But it's not gonna be easy." Keanu set Whiskers down gently and stood up, walking over to Jake. He didn't say anything at first. He just clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder, offering that quiet strength that seemed to flow naturally from him. "You don't have to face it alone," Keanu said simply. It was a small statement, but it carried so much weight. It wasn't just about facing the gang. Although Jake knew that was coming, it was about everything. It was about facing the man he used to be, the choices he had made, and the scars he carried with him. "I'm not sure I can change, Keanu," Jake admitted, his voice tight. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to walk away from everything I've known." Keanu didn't flinch or offer some generic platitude. He just looked Jake in the eyes, and for a moment, it felt like he saw right through him. "Strength isn't about never falling, Jake. It's about getting back up when you do." Jake nodded slowly, his mind processing Keanu's words. He had been knocked down more times than he could count, but every time, He had managed to get back up, through sheer will, through the fight that was ingrained in him. But this time, it wasn't about brute strength. It was about something else. Something deeper. That night, Jake stayed at Keanu's house. It wasn't about running away from his problems. It was about being in a place where he could actually think, where he didn't have to worry about what was coming for him next. They spent the evening talking, mostly about small things at first, but as the night wore on, the conversation grew more meaningful. Jake found himself opening up in a way he never had before, talking about the things that had shaped him, the things that had hurt him, and the reasons why he kept everyone at arm's length. Keanu listened without judgment, offering advice when needed, but mostly just being there. It was the kind of comfort Jake hadn't known he needed. He didn't realize how much he had longed for someone to just be there for him until he found it with Keanu. The next few days were filled with a quiet sense of purpose. Jake didn't immediately confront his old crew, but he started to prepare for the inevitable. He worked with Keanu, helping out around the house and taking care of Whiskers, but his mind was always on what lay ahead. He knew he couldn't avoid the confrontation forever. One afternoon, as Jake was tending to the yard, Keanu came out to join him. The sunlight was golden and soft, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake wasn't preoccupied by the chaos in his life. "You're ready," Keanu said quietly as he stood next to Jake, watching him rake the leaves. "You've already taken the hardest step." Jake paused, looking over at Keanu. He could feel the truth of those words, deep in his gut. He wasn't ready to face the gang again, but he was ready to face himself. "I hope you're right," Jake said, his voice low but steady. Keanu gave him a small, understanding smile. "I know I am." And in that moment, Jake knew that no matter what came next, he wasn't facing it alone. Jake had always been good at living in the moment. At least, that was how he justified the reckless things he did. When things got too heavy, he'd just ride off, drown out his thoughts with the roar of his motorcycle engine, or lose himself in the chaos of his old life. But now, he was beginning to realize that running away wasn't always the solution. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do was stay put and face what was waiting for you. It had been a few days since his run-in with his old crew. The tension in the air was thick, but Jake had made it clear to himself that he wasn't going to run this time. Every day, he went through the motions, helping Keanu with whatever he could, whether it was fixing things around the house or simply being there for Whiskers, who had become a quiet, comforting presence in his life. But underneath it all, the looming storm of his past was always there, just out of sight, waiting to strike. Keanu had been giving him space, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. The old crew wouldn't just let him go without a fight. They'd be back, and when they came, it wouldn't be with open arms. Jake could feel it in his gut. That afternoon, Keanu invited him to join him for a ride through the nearby forest. It was a peaceful place, the kind of place where Jake could clear his mind. He didn't usually go for rides unless he was escaping something, but today, he felt the urge to do something different. Keanu's invitation was just what he needed, a chance to reset, to breathe for a little while. As they rode side by side, the wind rushing past them, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of freedom that he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from something. He wasn't hiding from his past. He was just here, in the present. It was strange, almost surreal, but it felt right. They stopped by a small stream in the middle of the woods, the sound of the water flowing over rocks soothing to the ear. Keanu parked his bike and dismounted, stretching his legs. Jake followed suit, but instead of sitting down right away, he wandered to the edge of the water, looking down at the rippling surface. "You know, I've never really stopped to appreciate stuff like this," Jake said, his voice low but thoughtful. Keanu stood next to him, hands in his pockets, watching the water too. "Most people don't. They're too busy chasing something. We forget that sometimes, peace is all around us. We just have to stop and notice it." Jake glanced over at him, his expression a little softer than usual. "I think I've been chasing the wrong things for a long time." Keanu's gaze met his. "It's never too late to change, Jake, but it starts with understanding what's truly worth fighting for." Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down by the water, feeling the weight of Keanu's words sink in. He had spent so many years running from everything. His past, his mistakes, even his own heart. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to see the possibility of something different. He didn't have to keep running. Maybe what he was looking for wasn't somewhere far off, but right here in front of him, with Keanu, with Whiskers, and with this strange sense of peace that he had never allowed himself to feel before. They stayed by the stream for a while, not speaking much, just enjoying the quiet and the stillness. When it was time to leave, Keanu turned to Jake. "I'm proud of you, you know," Keanu said, his voice calm but sincere. Jake stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "For what? I haven't done anything yet." "You've made the decision to face your past," Keanu said. "That's the hardest part. You're not running anymore. That takes more strength than you know." Jake looked out toward the road, his bike parked nearby. The calmness of the forest contrasted sharply with the storm he knew was coming. "I'm not sure what happens next," Jake admitted, his voice more vulnerable than he'd intended. "But I'm ready. I think I'm finally ready to face it." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "Whatever happens, you're not alone. You've got this." As they mounted their bikes and began the ride back, Jake felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced before. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what might come. He didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't running from it anymore. When they got back to Keanu's house, the evening had already begun to settle in, casting long shadows across the yard. Jake stood by his bike for a moment, taking a deep breath as he prepared himself for what was next. The storm was coming, he could feel it in his bones. But for the first time, he wasn't scared of it. The following days felt like a quiet before the storm. Jake had prepared himself mentally, but the unease in the pit of his stomach didn't subside. Every time he looked at his phone, every time a truck rumbled down the road or a motorcycle engine revved in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was them, that the past was coming for him. Keanu seemed to notice it too. His calm presence didn't waver, but every now and then, Jake caught him glancing at the road, as if he were expecting something, or someone, to show up. Jake had started staying at Keanu's place more, working around the house, trying to keep his mind occupied. Whiskers, the cat that had once seemed like just a quirky addition to the house, had become an oddly comforting constant for him. It was strange to think how something so small could offer so much peace. The little creature, with her soft purring and content attitude, was a reminder that life didn't always have to be about fighting or running. Sometimes, peace just was. But peace, Jake knew, was fleeting. It was a Thursday afternoon when the phone call came. Jake had just finished fixing the fence in the backyard and was wiping his hands on a rag when the ringtone he hadn't heard in months pierced the silence. The number on the screen was unlisted, but Jake didn't need to see it to know who it was. His old gang didn't use regular phones. They had their own way of reaching people, of finding them when they wanted something. Jake's heart thudded in his chest, and for a moment, he just stood there, staring at the phone. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Keanu had been inside, but now he appeared in the doorway, looking at Jake with quiet understanding. He didn't ask who it was, didn't push, but he didn't have to. Jake already knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, Jake swiped the screen, accepting the call. He didn't say anything at first, just waited. The voice on the other end was gruff, familiar, but laced with a kind of coldness that made Jake's stomach twist. "It's been a while, Jake," the voice said, low and menacing. It was Billy, a former member of the gang, and one of the last people Jake had expected to hear from. Jake stayed silent for a moment, not trusting his voice. "You've been a ghost, man. Thought maybe you forgot about us," Billy continued, his tone a mockery of concern. "But you can't run forever." Jake's grip tightened around the phone, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What do you want, Billy?" Billy let out a harsh laugh. "You know what we want. We want you back. You've got debts to pay, old friend. You think you can just leave us behind? Nah, you're part of this. You always will be." The words hit Jake like a slap, and for a split second, he felt that old pull, that feeling of being trapped, of having no choice but to do what they asked. It was the same feeling he'd carried for years, and the reason why he had walked away from the gang in the first place. But then he thought of Keanu, of the life he was trying to build, of the freedom he'd found here. It wasn't just about leaving the gang. It was about leaving the person he used to be. And that person wasn't going to control him anymore. "I'm not coming back, Billy," Jake said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You can keep your threats and your empty promises. I'm done." There was a pause on the other end. Billy's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "We'll see about that," Billy said. Before hanging up, Jake stood still, the weight of the conversation settling on him like a heavy fog. He didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know if Billy would show up on his doorstep or if the gang would escalate things in ways he didn't want to imagine. Keanu stepped closer, not saying anything at first. He just placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, a quiet reassurance. "You did the right thing," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. Jake nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. "I don't know, man. They're not the type to just let things go." Keanu gave him a small, understanding smile. "I know, but you're not alone anymore. And you don't have to do this by yourself." Jake looked at Keanu, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a genuine sense of gratitude. Keanu wasn't just offering him a place to stay. He was offering him something far more valuable, a partnership, a chance to build something that wasn't based on fear or violence. That evening, Jake couldn't shake the sense of impending danger that hung in the air. He knew the call from Billy wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. But somehow, he also knew that he had changed. He wasn't the same guy who had ridden with that gang, not anymore. He had something now, something he hadn't even realized he was searching for. When night fell, the quiet of Keanu's house was a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing inside Jake. He couldn't let his past destroy what he had now, what he was beginning to build with Keanu. But the question remained, how far would the past go to pull him back in? Jake had always prided himself on being a man of action. When he was in the gang, things were simple. You had a problem, you solved it, no questions asked. But now, as he sat at the kitchen table that evening, the weight of his decision was settling in deeper than he'd anticipated. The threat from Billy wasn't just words. It was a promise of something that would come for him. It would come hard, and it would come fast. The calm of the evening felt like a lie. The house, usually quiet except for the occasional meow from Whiskers or the hum of the refrigerator, now seemed oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside made Jake's muscles tense. The fear of what might be coming next gnawed at him. Keanu, as usual, was the steady force in the room. He sat across from Jake, casually sipping his coffee, though Jake could see the small frown tugging at the corner of his lips. Keanu had a way of sensing things, of seeing when something wasn't quite right, and right now, he was watching Jake with that careful, knowing look. "Talk to me," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady, as if he were asking about the weather rather than the tension that hung between them. Jake leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, was waiting just beyond the horizon, just out of sight. The feeling wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same one he used to get before a big job, before things went sideways. "They're not gonna leave me alone," Jake muttered, more to himself than to Keanu. "Billy and the others, they think they can just drag me back in. And I don't know how far they're willing to go." Keanu set his cup down, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Jake. "So, what now?" Jake didn't answer immediately. What now? He had no idea. There was a part of him that wanted to run again, to disappear, to pick up his old life and leave everything behind. But that wasn't an option anymore. He had finally found something that mattered, someone who mattered, and he wasn't about to let his past destroy it. "I don't know," Jake admitted, his voice heavy, "but I can't do this alone. And I can't let them think they can control me anymore." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You don't have to be alone in this. I've got your back, Jake. You've made your choice, and I'll stand with you, no matter what happens next." Jake felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. He didn't want to pull Keanu into his mess. Keanu had been nothing but kind to him, had given him a place to stay, a purpose when Jake had none. And now, here he was, dragging Keanu into a fight that wasn't his. But Keanu wasn't the type of person to walk away from someone who needed him. Jake could see that now. In a way, Keanu was as much of a mystery as Jake was, calm, collected, but also someone who carried his own burdens, someone who had his own battles to fight. "I don't want you to get involved in this, Keanu," Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not your fight." Keanu's expression didn't change, his resolve unshaken. "It is now. When you step into my life, Jake, it becomes my fight too. I'm not backing down, not now." Jake stared at Keanu for a moment, taking in the sincerity in his eyes. He didn't know how he had found someone like Keanu, someone who cared without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. It was foreign to Jake, but it also felt like something worth fighting for. Before Jake could respond, a loud knock at the door startled them both. It wasn't the usual knock you'd get from a neighbor or a visitor. It was a forceful, heavy knock, the kind that made Jake's heart race in an instant. Keanu stood up, his face unreadable. "Stay here," he said. "I'll handle it." Jake didn't argue. He stayed rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He didn't know what was waiting for him on the other side of that door, but his gut told him it was something big, something that was going to change everything. Keanu walked to the door slowly, his movements deliberate. Jake could hear him speaking softly to whoever was outside, but he couldn't make out the words. His mind was too consumed with the fear of what was about to happen. Then, just as quickly as the knock had come, Keanu opened the door. Jake's eyes immediately went to the figure standing in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather jacket. He had the look of someone who had been on the road for a long time, someone who didn't care for much beyond survival. It was Billy. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The old gang member's eyes were cold, calculating, but there was a strange amusement behind them. He wasn't alone either. Two other figures stood behind him, men Jake recognized instantly. They were the muscle of the crew, the ones who handled things when things went south. Billy's gaze flicked past Keanu to Jake, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Didn't think you'd be so hard to find, Jake," Billy said, his voice low and almost taunting. "We got some unfinished business." Keanu didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his stance calm but firm. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice even, but with an underlying strength that Jake had never heard before. Billy chuckled, a harsh sound that grated on Jake's nerves. "This doesn't concern you, buddy. Step aside." Jake stepped forward before Keanu could respond. His mind was racing, but his voice came out steady. "What do you want, Billy?" Billy's smile widened, but it wasn't friendly. "What we want is simple. We want you back. We want you back in the fold. And if you don't, well, there's always other ways to make you see reason." Jake didn't flinch. He knew exactly what Billy was implying. He could feel the danger in the air. This wasn't a simple conversation anymore. This was a warning. Keanu stepped even closer to Jake, not saying a word, but positioning himself protectively. Jake glanced over at him, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face this alone. And then the first punch was thrown. The punch came out of nowhere, fast and brutal, hitting Jake square in the jaw. The force of it knocked him back, but he didn't fall. His instincts kicked in almost immediately. His muscles burned as he steadied himself, fighting the sharp sting in his mouth. Keanu was already moving, stepping between Jake and Billy like a human wall. There was no hesitation in his movements. He wasn't just standing up for Jake. He was protecting him, his friend, his partner, and someone who had become more important to him than he ever expected. Billy's eyes flashed with fury at the interruption, his smirk vanishing. He looked at Keanu like he was an inconvenience, a problem to be dealt with. The two henchmen standing behind Billy were already advancing, their eyes cold and calculating. Jake felt the heat of the moment pushing through him. He'd fought before. Hell, he'd fought every single day when he was part of the gang. But this felt different. It wasn't about survival anymore. It wasn't about earning respect or maintaining a reputation. It was about protecting what he had now. Billy's voice cut through the air like a knife, his words laced with venom. "You really think you can stop me, pretty boy? I'm not here to play games. You should have stayed out of this." Keanu didn't flinch, his expression unreadable. "This is my house, Billy. You're not going to get what you want." The tension between them was electric. The two men stared each other down, each waiting for the other to make a move. Billy's men were closing in on Jake, their fists clenched, but Jake wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let them walk all over him again. In one swift movement, Jake shoved the nearest thug out of the way, his fist connecting with the guy's gut. The thug gasped, staggering back. Jake's muscles screamed in protest, but he was already moving again, instinctively dodging a punch from the other thug before landing a solid right hook to his jaw. Keanu took the opportunity, spinning around and throwing a punch of his own that landed on Billy's side. Billy grunted, but he was quick to retaliate, swinging a powerful left hook that landed against Keanu's ribs. Keanu winced, but he didn't lose his footing. The fight was just beginning, and he wasn't going to let Billy think he had the upper hand. Jake couldn't help but admire the way Keanu fought. His calm, controlled movements were nothing like the frantic brawls Jake had been used to. It was like Keanu had a calm center to him, no matter how chaotic things got. And right now, that calm was exactly what they both needed. The fight was escalating. The room seemed to shrink with every blow, every footstep. Whiskers, who had been lounging on a chair just moments before, let out a startled meow and darted out of the room. The sounds of fists meeting flesh and feet scuffling filled the house, the adrenaline fueling the chaos. Jake landed another punch, this time catching the second thug off guard. He grinned through the pain, the fight in him fully awakened. He was still Jake. He still had that fire, that hunger. But this time, it wasn't for the gang. It wasn't for power. It was for survival, and for Keanu, the person who had chosen to fight beside him, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Keanu, meanwhile, was holding his ground against Billy, their movements fast, brutal, and calculated. There was something primal in the way Keanu moved, as if he'd done this kind of thing countless times before. Jake had known that Keanu wasn't some soft guy who had no experience in the world they now found themselves in. But seeing it up close, feeling the intensity of it, made Jake realize just how much he had underestimated him. Billy, now visibly irritated, swung a heavy punch toward Keanu's face, but Keanu ducked just in time, sweeping Billy's legs out from under him. Billy hit the floor with a loud crash, momentarily stunned. Keanu didn't give him a second to recover. Before Billy could get up, Keanu was on him, straddling his chest, pinning his arms to the ground. "You should have stayed away," Keanu said through gritted teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Now look where we are." Billy glared up at him, seething with rage, but he wasn't done. With a grunt of frustration, he kicked his legs up, sending Keanu off balance for just a moment. Keanu's grip loosened, and Billy took the opportunity to scramble to his feet. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Meanwhile, Jake was finishing up with the second thug. The guy had tried to land another hit, but Jake blocked it, twisting his arm in a way that made the thug scream in pain. He heard the guy's bones crack under the pressure, and a sick sense of satisfaction washed over him. The fight was slowly starting to wind down. The two gang members, now nursing their wounds, were backing away, their faces contorted with pain and fear. Billy, seeing that his men were no longer standing, straightened up and glared at Jake and Keanu. "This isn't over," Billy hissed. "You've made a huge mistake, Jake. You think you can just walk away from us? You think you can change?" Jake wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes locked on Billy with cold determination. "You're wrong. I'm not going back. I'm not part of your world anymore. And you can't make me." Billy's eyes burned with hatred. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before turning and walking out of the door, dragging his men with him. Jake exhaled deeply, his body aching from the blows he had taken. But the relief of seeing them leave was overpowering. It wasn't over. He knew that, but for now, they had one. Keanu stood next to him, taking in the aftermath. He was breathing heavily but wasn't visibly hurt. "You okay?" he asked. Jake nodded, wincing slightly as he flexed his hand. "Yeah, I'll be fine." They stood there for a moment, just the two of them, taking in the quiet that followed the chaos. Whiskers cautiously poked her head around the corner, her eyes wide. The fight was over, but Jake knew that the war was far from it. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, Jake said, his voice soft but resolute. They're not going to stop. Keanu met his gaze, a quiet understanding in his eyes. I know, but whatever happens next, we face it together. Jake felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could still work out. But one thing was certain, his past wasn't done with him yet. And neither was Billy. The adrenaline from the fight still buzzed through Jake's veins long after Billy and his crew had left. His body ached with every move. His head throbbed with the aftereffects of the blows he'd taken. But the feeling of victory, however small, kept him grounded. They had won this round. But Jake knew all too well that the battle wasn't over. Far from it. Billy and the others weren't the type to let things slide, especially not with Jake. Keanu was already cleaning up the mess. He was the first to move after the fight, his actions precise and methodical. He went around the house, shutting windows and locking doors. Jake followed him, trying to ignore the bruises that were starting to bloom on his skin, the cuts that stung with every movement. Do you think that's the last of them? Jake asked, his voice gruff as he wiped blood from his lip. Keanu didn't look up, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. No, that was just a warning, Jake. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. Jake nodded, his mind racing. He had been in situations like this before, times when he thought he could outrun the past, only to have it catch up with him faster than he could handle. The gang wasn't just a part of his history, it was a part of him. The pull of it, the familiar faces, the promises of loyalty, it all had a way of clawing back into his life when he least expected it. But this time, things were different. He wasn't the same man who had ridden with them. He had something to protect now. Someone. Keanu. Keanu turned to face him, his expression unreadable. We need to make a decision, Jake. We can't keep hiding out here forever. Billy and his crew aren't going to give up. If you want this to end, we need to make sure they don't come back. Jake's chest tightened. The idea of going back to the life he'd walked away from was terrifying. But Keanu was right. Hiding wouldn't solve anything. They couldn't live in fear, always looking over their shoulders. I'm not running again, Jake said, his voice firmer than he felt. I've done that long enough. Keanu gave him a slow nod, like he'd been waiting for Jake to say those words. We face this head-on then. Together. We can figure out how to end this, but we need to be smart about it. Jake glanced out the window, watching the sky darken with the early evening light. The streets were empty, quiet. For now. But he knew that would change soon. Billy's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You'll regret this. Jake didn't regret it. Not for a second. But that didn't mean the fight was going to be easy. How do we stop them? Jake asked, turning back to Keanu. Keanu didn't hesitate. First, we need information. We need to know what they're planning, where they're at, and we need to be ready for anything. Jake felt a weight in his chest. The old instincts kicked in, the ones that told him to go in guns blazing, to take the fight to them before they even knew what hit them. But he had learned, the hard way, that there was no glory in that. This wasn't some reckless battle with no rules. This was his life now. Keanu's life. All right, Jake said, running a hand through his hair. We do this your way. We get the intel first. But we don't wait too long. They're not going to be patient with us. Keanu's gaze softened just slightly, a look of approval flashing in his eyes. We won't wait, but we need to make sure we have the right people on our side. We can't do this alone. That was the thing Jake hadn't thought about. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat that he hadn't realized the scope of what they were up against. Billy wasn't just some rogue element. He was part of a larger network, a world of people who didn't hesitate to put the pressure on when they wanted something. Jake had been part of that world. He knew how it worked, how quickly things could spiral out of control. We'll need to find out who's still with them, Jake said, pacing slowly. I don't know who's left from the old crew, but I do know where to look. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And where's that? Jake met his gaze. There's a bar. A dive. It's where we used to meet up. If anyone's going to know what's going on with Billy, it's the people still hanging around there. Keanu nodded, his expression serious. I'll go with you. We'll do this, right? Jake wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the calm assurance in Keanu's voice was a comfort. He wasn't alone in this. Keanu had proven that over and over again. Jake had never had anyone he could rely on before. Not like this. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. They gathered what they needed, and when the time came, they headed out into the night. The air was crisp, biting at Jake's skin as they walked toward the bar. The streets were empty, the city quiet, as if holding its breath. Jake's mind raced, but he pushed the worry aside. There was no time for doubt now. The bar was exactly as Jake remembered it. A small, run-down building tucked between two larger businesses, the kind of place people went to disappear. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting a faint glow over the street. A part of him was hesitant, but he forced himself forward, knowing there was no turning back. Keanu was right beside him, his presence solid and reassuring. They stepped into the dimly lit interior, the stale scent of smoke and alcohol hanging heavy in the air. The patrons barely looked up from their drinks, but Jake's eyes scanned the room, searching for the familiar faces of the old crew. He wasn't expecting any warm welcomes, but he knew this was where he'd find answers. The bartender, an older man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, didn't look surprised to see Jake. "Back again," he grunted. Jake nodded, his voice low. "Just looking for someone." The bartender's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake thought he was going to refuse to help. But then, with a gruff sigh, the bartender leaned in closer. "Billy's been through here recently, but I wouldn't go looking for trouble, kid. You're not the first one to try and get answers." Keanu stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're not looking for trouble. We're looking for information." The bartender hesitated, then glanced around the room before nodding. "You didn't hear it from me," he muttered. "But there's a meeting tonight. A big one. Billy's been making plans. If you want to know what's going on, that's your best bet." Jake felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. This was it, the first real lead he'd had in weeks. He glanced at Keanu, who nodded, his face unreadable. "Where is it?" Jake asked, his voice steady. The bartender leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Out by the old warehouse. Just past the train yard. Don't go in blind. It's not just Billy you'll have to worry about." Jake's stomach twisted. There was no turning back now. The old gang had their sights set on him, and the meeting tonight would be the next step in this dangerous game. "We'll be careful," Keanu said, his tone quiet but resolute. "Let's finish this." Jake nodded. For the first time since all of this started, he felt a spark of confidence. He wasn't alone. And tonight, they were going to take the fight to Billy. The old warehouse loomed ahead, an ominous silhouette against the dark sky. Jake's boots crunched over gravel as he and Keanu approached, the sounds of the night swallowed by the vast emptiness of the industrial complex. This place wasn't just a hideout. It was a symbol, a remnant of a past Jake had fought to leave behind. Every step felt like it echoed through the walls of his mind, stirring up memories he'd rather forget. The warehouse was where the old crew had met for planning, where the deals had been made, where Jake had done things he wasn't proud of. But this wasn't the same. Not anymore. Keanu walked beside him, his movements measured, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. They didn't talk much as they approached the building, both of them understanding the weight of what was to come. Tonight, they weren't just walking into a meeting. They were walking into a war zone. The building was abandoned, or at least it looked that way. The rusting metal doors stood ajar, a faint light spilling out from the cracks. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. The bartender's words echoed in his head. "It's not just Billy you'll have to worry about." That nagging feeling of unease grew stronger with every step they took toward the door. Keanu gave him a quick glance, his face stoic but alert. "We stick to the plan," he whispered, just loud enough for Jake to hear. "We get in, get the information, and get out." Jake nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what they were walking into. All he knew was that Billy's crew was involved, and the last thing he wanted was to get caught in the middle of a bloody confrontation. They slipped through the door, the darkness inside swallowing them whole. The only sound was their footsteps on the cracked concrete floor. Jake's eyes adjusted quickly, and he could make out the shapes of crates and industrial equipment stacked in the corners. The place was a maze, filled with shadows that seemed to move in the corners of his vision. Keanu's voice was a whisper in the dark. "Stay low. We don't want anyone spotting us before we know what's going on." They crept deeper into the warehouse, moving silently through the shadows. The faint sound of voices reached them, low and muffled, but distinct enough for Jake to hear. It was coming from the back of the warehouse. Jake signaled to Keanu, and they made their way toward the sound, careful to stay out of sight. As they rounded a corner, the dim glow of a lamp illuminated a group of men gathered around a table. Billy was there, sitting at the head of the group, his arms folded across his chest. Several other familiar faces surrounded him. Jake recognized them all, men from his old crew, men who had once been his brothers. But there were others too, men who looked rougher, more dangerous, like they didn't belong to Jake's old world at all. Billy was talking, his voice low but commanding. "We've got to act fast. Jake thinks he can run off into the sunset with Keanu Reeves and leave this life behind. But he's wrong. He's got no idea who he's messing with." The group nodded, a few murmurs of agreement echoing around the table. Jake felt a tightening in his chest. Billy wasn't just angry. He was personal. This wasn't about business anymore. It was about revenge. Keanu was beside him, watching the group closely. "We need to wait for the right moment," he whispered. Jake gritted his teeth, his fingers twitching with the urge to act. But he knew Keanu was right. They needed to gather as much intel as possible before making their move. He was here to get answers, not to start a fight. At least, not yet. "Billy's not gonna stop," one of the men said, his voice low but filled with menace. "You think we let a traitor walk away from all this? He's not just your average deserter. He's a problem." Jake's fists clenched. He could feel the rage building inside him, but he held it back. He wasn't going to let his emotions control him. Not now. Not when he was so close to getting the answers he needed. "We'll deal with Jake soon enough," Billy's voice interrupted, cold and final. "But for now, we focus on Keanu. He's the bigger threat. Once we take care of him, Jake won't have anyone left to hide behind." Jake's heart stopped. The air in the warehouse suddenly felt suffocating. Billy wasn't just after him. He was after Keanu too. This was bigger than Jake had realized. Keanu's hand brushed against Jake's arm, a silent reassurance. He'd known the danger from the start, but hearing it out loud made it all feel more real. The weight of the situation settled over them both. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. There was no turning back now. Keanu was right. They couldn't keep hiding. They had to face Billy, face the crew, and end this once and for all. He glanced over at Keanu, who gave him a subtle nod. They were in this together, and no matter how dangerous it got, they would see it through. Jake turned his focus back to the table, where Billy and his men continued their discussion. The words were starting to blur together, but one thing was clear. They were planning something big, something that would affect not just Jake, but everyone around him. "I don't care what it takes," Billy was saying now. "I'm going to make him pay." Jake's blood boiled. He wasn't going to let Billy drag him, or Keanu, back into the hell they'd fought so hard to escape. The time for patience was over. It was time to act. Keanu turned to Jake, his voice low and controlled. "You ready?" Jake nodded. The adrenaline surged through him, drowning out the fear. "Let's do this." Without another word, they moved in sync, stepping out from their hiding spot. The crunch of their footsteps against the floor echoed through the space, drawing the attention of the men at the table. The room went silent as all eyes turned toward them, and Billy's cold gaze locked onto Jake's. "I knew you'd show up," Billy sneered, standing up slowly. "You just can't stay out of this life, can you?" Jake's voice was steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "This ends tonight, Billy." A tense silence hung in the air before Billy's laughter broke it, bitter and sharp. "You think you can take me down, Jake? You're nothing without your crew, and you'll die without them." Jake didn't flinch. "I don't need a crew. I've got Keanu, and that's all I need." The standoff was inevitable. The tension in the room crackled, thick and suffocating. Billy's men stood up, their hands ready to fight, but Jake and Keanu weren't backing down. It was now or never. The sun was just beginning to rise as Jake and Keanu walked through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet. The warehouse behind them, now abandoned, held the remnants of their battle, broken crates, discarded weapons, and the ghost of what had just transpired. Jake felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The fight was over. Billy was down for now. But the reality of what came next was starting to sink in. They couldn't stay in the city. Not now. Not with the remnants of Billy's crew still out there, licking their wounds, plotting revenge. Keanu, ever the strategist, spoke first. We need to lay low. Find a place to rest. Get our bearings. Figure out our next move. Jake nodded, his mind already racing through options. They had to move fast, get out of the city before someone came looking for them. But where? What could they trust anymore? Their old haunts, the familiar spots in the city, were no longer safe. Keanu glanced at him, sensing his thoughts. We don't need to have all the answers right now. We need rest, Jake. That's the only thing that matters. Jake let out a long breath, his body still sore from the night's fight. The adrenaline was wearing off, and fatigue was starting to take its toll. His side throbbed from the knife wound, but it wasn't anything that would stop him. Keanu was right. Rest was what they needed. They needed time to think, time to plan. Let's head out of town, Jake muttered. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one will find us for a while. Keanu gave a curt nod. I know just the place. The two of them made their way to Keanu's car, parked a few blocks away from the warehouse. The streets were still eerily empty, as if the world had yet to wake up. It felt strange to be walking through it, like they were the only two people left alive. The weight of the previous night's events hung heavy on their shoulders. As Keanu started the car, Jake leaned back in his seat, staring out the window. The city was fading behind them, and in the distance, the landscape stretched out into nothingness. He thought about everything that had happened, how it all came crashing down, how the life he had tried so hard to leave was still pulling him back in. But there was something different now. He wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't part of that world. He had something worth fighting for now. His future, his freedom, and the strange bond he'd formed with Keanu. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like there was hope on the horizon. The darkness that had surrounded him for so long was starting to lift, and he could almost taste the possibility of a new beginning. Keanu broke the silence as they drove. You're thinking too much, he said, his voice calm but knowing. We've got time, Jake. Let's just focus on what's next. What's ahead of us? Jake gave a dry laugh, glancing over at Keanu. That's easier said than done. My mind's been racing since we walked out of that warehouse. Keanu smiled slightly, keeping his eyes on the road. You don't have to do it alone anymore. You've got me. It was a simple statement, but it hit Jake harder than he expected. The weight of all the years of isolation, of living a life where trust was a commodity he couldn't afford, all seemed to fall away in that moment. Keanu was right. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to believe in something other than survival. A few hours later, they drove through small towns, past empty fields, and eventually found themselves in a remote cabin tucked away on the outskirts of a quiet forest. The place was isolated enough that it felt like a world away from the chaos they had just left behind. There were no signs of life around, no prying eyes. It was the perfect place to disappear, at least for now. Keanu parked the car, and they stepped out into the cool morning air. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the crispness in his lungs, and for a brief moment, the weight of the past few days lifted. He felt a small flicker of peace. They weren't safe yet, far from it, but for the first time, the future didn't seem quite so uncertain. Inside the cabin, Keanu immediately set to work, securing the doors and windows, checking for anything that might be out of place. Jake, meanwhile, sank into one of the worn armchairs by the fireplace, his body aching from the fight. His mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened, but now it was quieter, more manageable. Keanu joined him a few minutes later, pulling out a small bag of supplies from the trunk. He didn't say much. Keanu never did. But Jake could feel his calm presence, and for once, it was enough to just sit in silence. As the hours passed, Jake's body began to relax. He'd always been on edge, always prepared for the next threat, the next fight. But this was different. There was a chance, just a small one, that they could actually get a break. Are we really safe here? Jake asked, his voice more uncertain than he'd like to admit. He knew Keanu had lived through a lot, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another moment of calm before the storm. Keanu set his bag down and leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. For now, yes. But it's not going to last forever. We need to stay ahead of Billy's crew. They won't give up that easily. Jake nodded, running a hand through his hair. The fight with Billy had been brutal, but it was only one part of the equation. The real danger came from the fallout. Billy had connections, allies, people who would keep coming after them. I know, Jake said, but for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm running anymore. Keanu raised an eyebrow. You're not, are you? Jake's lips curled into a tired smile. I guess not. They sat in silence again, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The night was closing in, but this time, Jake didn't feel the gnawing fear in his gut. He didn't feel the need to keep looking over his shoulder. There was still a long way to go, and things were still dangerous. But for the first time in years, Jake had something to fight for other than just survival. The days that followed were a blur. Jake and Keanu kept to their routine, staying low, avoiding the outside world, and keeping their heads down. The quiet of the cabin, surrounded by dense forest, was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed them to recover physically from the brutal fight, but it also gave Jake too much time to think. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't constantly filled with the noise of the streets, the roar of engines, or the adrenaline-fueled chaos of his past. Here, in the silence, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that everything he had tried to leave behind was still lurking just out of sight. Keanu noticed the change in him almost immediately. Jake wasn't talking much, and when he did, it was often about the past. About things he'd never wanted to face before. You've been quiet lately, Keanu said one afternoon, breaking the silence that had hung thick in the cabin for hours. He was sitting across from Jake at the small table, flipping through a magazine in an attempt to keep himself occupied. Jake didn't look up. He stared out the window instead, watching the wind whip through the trees. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The kind of shadows that always made Jake feel like someone was watching. I'm fine, Jake muttered, but even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. Keanu raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had always known that Jake's mind worked in mysterious ways, that when things started to feel too quiet, it often meant Jake was battling his own demons. And Keanu wasn't about to push him, not yet. He knew better than anyone that Jake had a way of shutting down, of retreating into himself when things got too heavy. Still, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was on the edge of something. It was like a storm was building inside him, and Keanu wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it in. You know, if you need to talk about it, Keanu began. But Jake cut him off, his tone sharper than he intended. I don't need to talk about it. Keanu didn't flinch. He'd heard that line a million times. But this time, something felt different. He could see the tension in Jake's shoulders, the way his hands were tightly clenched on the table. Jake wasn't fine. Not by a long shot. Keanu sighed and stood up, stretching his legs. He wasn't going to push, but he wasn't going to let Jake spiral either. All right, just remember that I'm here if you need me, he said, his voice soft, as he walked toward the window. Jake's gaze flickered to Keanu for a moment, then back to the trees outside. I know, he replied quietly. There was a long pause before Keanu spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You've been running from something, haven't you? Jake stiffened, his jaw tightening. The question hung in the air, the words cutting through the quiet of the room like a blade. Keanu was right, of course. Jake had been running for years, running from the violence, from the choices he'd made, from the people he'd hurt. But there was something deeper, something that even Jake had tried to bury in the darkest corners of his mind. Maybe I'm just tired of it, Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were far away, lost in the memory of things he couldn't escape. Tired of the constant fight, the choices I made. Keanu didn't say anything at first. He let the silence hang between them, giving Jake space. He knew that this wasn't something Jake would open up about easily, but the cracks were starting to show. And Keanu wasn't going to turn away now. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his movements. I've always felt like I had no choice, you know? Like it was either fight or die. Like I was stuck in this loop, this cycle that I couldn't get out of. Keanu turned from the window, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Jake. What about now? Do you feel like you're stuck? Jake's gaze flicked to him, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. I don't know. I'm trying not to be. But sometimes, it feels like the past is just waiting for me to slip up. Like it's right there, just out of reach, and I can't shake it. Keanu stepped closer, his tone serious now. Jake, you don't have to carry that weight alone anymore. You've got a shot at something different. A life without all the violence, without the endless chase. But you have to stop running from your past. Jake looked away, his eyes dark with a mixture of regret and fear. I don't know how, he whispered, almost to himself. Keanu's voice softened, his words slower. You start by forgiving yourself. Jake was silent for a long time. The weight of Keanu's words hung heavily in the room. Forgiveness. It was a concept Jake had never fully understood. How could he forgive himself for the things he had done? The lives he had destroyed? I don't even know if I deserve it, Jake finally said, his voice filled with a raw vulnerability he hadn't shown anyone in years. Keanu didn't reply at first. He simply placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, grounding him in that moment. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady presence that said everything Jake needed to hear. You don't have to deserve it. You just have to take the first step, Keanu said quietly. Jake exhaled slowly, his mind racing as he processed the weight of the conversation. He had spent so many years trying to outrun the guilt, the shame, and the mistakes of his past. And now, for the first time, someone was telling him it was okay to stop running. It was okay to face it. For the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to believe it. Later that night, the fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin, its warm glow flickering against the darkened walls. Jake sat alone, staring into the flames, his mind still churning with everything Keanu had said. The quiet felt different now, like a space where he could breathe, where he didn't have to constantly look over his shoulder. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if he was truly ready to face the man he used to be. But for the first time, he was willing to try. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of the cycle. The past wasn't going to be easy to shake off, but with Keanu by his side, maybe it didn't have to define him anymore. The next few days were an unusual kind of peace for Jake. It was strange, almost unsettling, to wake up without the feeling of impending danger, without the constant gnawing of anxiety that something was always about to go wrong. The cabin, isolated in the quiet expanse of the forest, had become a sanctuary. The world outside felt far away, distant, muffled by the walls of the cabin, and yet Jake knew it wasn't gone. It would never be gone, not really. Keanu seemed content with the stillness. For someone who had lived through as much chaos as he had, this kind of calm was rare. He spent most of his time cooking, or tinkering with the car, or sitting outside and staring out at the vast stretch of forest. He didn't push Jake to talk any more than he had to. But the silence between them, while comfortable, was starting to feel like a ticking clock. It was only a matter of time before something happened. That something came on the fourth day. Jake had been up early, restless, as usual. He had taken a walk around the perimeter of the cabin, checking the area for any signs of activity. No one was supposed to know they were here, but Jake never trusted that kind of assumption. Keanu had been on edge too, in his own quiet way, though he masked it well. When Jake returned to the cabin, he found Keanu sitting by the table, his phone in hand, staring at it with an unreadable expression. Something wrong? Jake asked, noticing the change in Keanu's demeanor. The easygoing calm he'd had the last few days was gone, replaced by something sharper. Keanu looked up, his brow furrowed. "We've got company," he said, his voice low and steady. Jake's pulse spiked. "Billy's crew?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He just set the phone down on the table and looked at Jake for a long beat. When he spoke, his voice was tight with a warning. "Not Billy, but someone who knows we're here." Jake's heart skipped. "Who?" Keanu shook his head, tapping his fingers on the table. I don't know yet, but I've been getting these texts. Someone's been tracking us. The weight of the words settled in Jake's gut. They had been safe here. At least, they thought they were. But now, the sense of peace they'd found had begun to unravel. Someone was looking for them, and that meant the calm was just the calm before the storm. Do you think it's someone from my past? Jake asked, leaning against the doorframe, his tone a mix of frustration and fear. Keanu's eyes narrowed. Could be, but it could also be someone else entirely, someone who's been keeping tabs on you for a while. Maybe even Billy's people. The thought of Billy finding them was enough to make Jake's blood run cold. But there was something more. This feeling, deep in his chest, that someone knew too much about them. Someone who had been following their every move. Jake moved to the table, his hands bracing the wood. What now? Keanu stood up, his movements deliberate. We don't stick around to find out. We need to get ready. Later that day, Keanu had gone through the motions of preparing to leave. His calm demeanor remained, but Jake could see the tension in his eyes. There was no mistaking the urgency in Keanu's actions. They had to leave the cabin, fast, and they had to move quietly. Jake didn't need to ask what the next steps were. He was already pulling on his boots and grabbing his jacket. Keanu had already packed the essentials, a bag with weapons, supplies, and the car keys. They weren't going to stay and fight. Not yet. They needed more information. They needed to find out who was after them and why. As they loaded the car, Keanu's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and then stuffed it back into his pocket without a word. Jake didn't ask. I'll drive, Jake said as he slid into the driver's seat. Keanu didn't argue. He slid into the passenger seat, eyes scanning the trees outside. Where are we going? Jake asked, starting the engine and easing the car out of the driveway. Keanu paused before answering. Somewhere safe. Somewhere that's off the grid for a while. We need to lay low. Jake nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. As much as he hated the thought of running again, he knew it was their only option. The fight was coming, but they had to make sure they were ready for it. The drive. They didn't speak much as they drove, the road stretching on before them. The quiet of the countryside passed by in a blur of rolling hills, empty highways, and the occasional small town. Jake kept his eyes on the road, scanning every car that passed, every shadow that moved along the edges of the road. The world felt too big, too open. Keanu didn't break his silence, but Jake knew he was analyzing every possibility in his mind, weighing their options. After several hours, they reached a small town on the outskirts of a mountain range, far from the city. The town was quiet, too quiet, almost. It felt like the kind of place people came to escape, to hide, or to start over. Let's check into a motel, Keanu said as they pulled into a parking lot. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long. Jake pulled into a space, the gravel crunching under the tires. He felt the weight of everything pressing down on him again. The sense of being hunted, the unknown of who was after them, and the fear that his past was never going to let him go. Keanu pushed the door open and glanced at Jake. This isn't over, Jake. We need to find out who's behind this, and we need to do it fast. Jake's jaw tightened as he nodded. He wasn't used to running, not like this, but right now, it was the only choice they had. The calm had ended. The storm was approaching, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. The motel room smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke, the kind that lingered in the carpet and the heavy curtains, impossible to ignore. Jake didn't mind it, though. He wasn't there to enjoy comfort. He was there to survive. Keanu had already begun setting up their temporary base of operations. He moved silently, methodically, as if every action was part of a larger plan. Jake could tell that he was thinking several steps ahead, his mind working through all the possible outcomes. Keanu had been through this kind of situation before. He knew how to stay one step ahead of danger. Jake, on the other hand, was used to fighting in the moment, reacting instinctively. But this was a new kind of battle, and it made him uneasy. Keanu sat down at the small table in the corner, spreading out a map of the surrounding area. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the TV screen in the corner and the low light from the street lamp outside. Okay, here's the plan, Keanu said, pointing to the map. We stay here for the night, keep a low profile. No one's gonna find us here unless we let them. Tomorrow, we head to a safer spot. I know a place in the mountains where we can lay low for a while. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You sure about that? I'm not ready to just hide out forever, Keanu. We need to figure out who's after us. Keanu's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. I know, Jake. I want the same thing. But right now, we can't take any chances. We need to get more information. We need to figure out who's tracking us and why. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't want to hide. But Keanu was right. They couldn't be reckless. They had to be smart about this. Keanu pulled out his phone and looked at the latest text messages again. Jake couldn't see the screen from where he stood, but he could tell that the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. Whoever was behind these messages had been following them closely, and they were getting closer. The text messages had been cryptic at first, just small details that could have been coincidences, but now, they were too specific. Keanu's phone buzzed again, and he stared at it for a moment before putting it down with a frustrated sigh. More of the same, Keanu muttered. Nothing that tells us who's behind it all. Jake pushed off the wall and walked over, glancing down at the phone. We're not going to get anything out of these, are we? Keanu shook his head. No, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Later that night, Jake couldn't sleep. His mind was too active, spinning with possibilities. He kept thinking about the people from his past, the ones he had wronged, the enemies he had made over the years. He could feel the weight of it all again. The bad choices, the lives he had ruined, the debt that had piled up over the years. As much as Keanu tried to reassure him, Jake wasn't sure he could outrun his past. It had a way of finding him, no matter how far he went, no matter how deep he hid. And now, the shadow of his past was closing in once more. He paced the room, trying to burn off the nervous energy that had taken hold of him. The window was cracked open, just enough to let in a bit of cool air, and he could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance. But that was all. No footsteps in the hall, no sounds of anyone moving outside. Just the oppressive silence of a world waiting for something to happen. Keanu had already gone to sleep on the bed, his back to Jake, the sound of his breathing slow and steady. But Jake knew better than to let his guard down. He kept an eye on the door and the window, watching for any sign that someone might be outside. It wasn't long before he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up outside, the low rumble of an engine, followed by the squeal of brakes. Jake's instincts kicked in immediately. He moved to the window, peering out through the slats of the blinds. There was a black SUV parked in front of the motel. The headlights were off, but the engine was still running. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but that didn't mean anything. It could be anyone. And right now, that was the problem. They were vulnerable, exposed. Keanu stirred in the bed, groggily lifting his head. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low, hoarse with sleep. Jake didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his jacket and checking the small bag of supplies they'd packed. Every move was deliberate, precise. He didn't need to say it aloud, but Keanu understood. They needed to get out. Before Jake could reach the door, Keanu was up, his expression serious. "I'll go check it out. You stay here and keep watch." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Keanu was already heading for the door, his movements quick and silent. Jake knew better than to argue. Keanu was the one with the experience, the one who could handle situations like this. He just hoped it wasn't too late. The moment of truth. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Jake stood in the dimly lit motel room, his fingers tapping against the windowsill, his eyes never leaving the black SUV outside. The engine had stopped, but the vehicle remained, its dark form looming like a shadow. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together who it could be. Was it Billy's men? Someone else from his past? Or was it something else entirely? Whoever they were, they had found him, and now they were waiting. He heard the creak of the motel door opening. Jake spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he kept hidden in his jacket. His body was taut, ready for a fight. But it wasn't Keanu who stepped into the room. It was a stranger. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a pair of sunglasses despite the late hour. He didn't look like someone you'd see at a motel. He looked like trouble. and Jake could see it in the way the man moved. This was no ordinary guest. Jake didn't hesitate. He reached for his gun, but before he could pull it out, the stranger raised a hand, signaling him to stay calm. "You don't need that," the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I'm not here to fight." Jake's grip on the gun didn't loosen, but he stopped. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Name's Garrett. I think we need to talk." The stranger's presence in the room was like a cold wind sweeping through a room that had already been suffocating. Jake could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, every instinct telling him to be ready for a fight. But something about Garrett's demeanor, calm, collected, almost eerily so, made Jake hesitate. Garrett's dark sunglasses made it hard to read his intentions, but Jake could see the faintest glint of something dangerous in his eyes. He wasn't a normal guy. Jake had dealt with enough types like him to know that much. "Talk?" Jake echoed, his voice low, testing the waters. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." Garrett didn't seem fazed by Jake's suspicion. Instead, he slid into one of the cheap chairs near the window, as if he was making himself comfortable for a long conversation. "I'm not here to threaten you. At least, not directly." Jake didn't take his eyes off Garrett, his hand still close to his weapon. He hadn't decided whether to believe the man, but if Garrett thought he was going to just sit and chat about whatever had brought him here, he was sorely mistaken. "Then why are you here?" Jake's voice was sharp, his patience running thin. "I'm here because I can help you," Garrett said, his smile never wavering. "The truth is, you've made some powerful enemies, Jake. But you already know that, don't you?" Jake stiffened, the words hitting him harder than he'd expected. He didn't want to admit it, but Garrett was right. He had been running for a long time, dodging the consequences of his past decisions, and now they had finally caught up with him. The people who had wronged him, the choices he had made, they were all coming home to roost. "I don't need your help," Jake shot back, his voice hard. "And I definitely don't need anyone else trying to pull me deeper into whatever this is." Garrett tilted his head slightly, as if amused by Jake's defiance. "You can think that, but you won't get very far. You're already deep in this game, whether you like it or not." Jake's gaze flickered briefly to the door, his mind running through escape routes. But Garrett's presence wasn't something that would be easy to shake. There was something off about the man, something that made him feel like more of a predator than an ally. "I don't know who you are or who you work for," Jake said, "but I'm done with being anyone's pawn." Garrett let out a low chuckle, almost as if Jake's words were nothing but amusing. "Oh, I'm not here to make you a pawn. That's not how I do things." He leaned forward, the smile still in place. "I'm here because I'm offering you a way out. A way to not just survive, but to come out on top. But that's going to require trust. And I'm not sure you're ready for that." "Trust?" Jake scoffed, his voice laced with bitterness. "The only thing I trust is what I can control." Garrett's expression shifted slightly, the humor in his eyes replaced by a sharp edge. "And you think you're in control now? You think running is going to solve anything? You think hiding in a cheap motel in the middle of nowhere is going to keep you safe from the people who are coming for you?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew Garrett was right. They were living on borrowed time. The people who were after him weren't going to stop. He had been running, and now, the game had changed. The question was, what was Garrett really offering? Outside the motel, Keanu had been listening from the other side of the room, his hand on the doorknob, listening for any signs of trouble. Jake hadn't said a word in the last few minutes, and that was enough to set off a red flag. Keanu knew Jake wasn't the kind of guy to back down easily, especially when it came to outsiders. If Garrett was still in the room and Jake hadn't come to get him, that meant something had shifted. The last thing Keanu wanted was to burst in and make things worse, but his gut told him something was off. Garrett wasn't here for a friendly chat. As Keanu shifted his weight, preparing to make his move, he heard the sound of the door handle turning. Jake stepped out, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered briefly to Keanu before he spoke. "Get your stuff. We're moving out." Keanu didn't need any more information. He grabbed his bag, his senses heightened, and moved toward the door. "Where to?" Keanu asked, his tone cautious. Not sure yet, Jake replied, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the parking lot, where the black SUV still Saturday, but wherever we go, we're not staying here. Back at the motel room, Garrett remained seated in the same position, his eyes following Jake and Keanu's every move. He knew that getting Jake to trust him wasn't going to be easy. It was clear that Jake was a man who valued his independence, his ability to control his own fate. But Garrett had the upper hand now. He was patient. He knew how to play the long game. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can just run from this, Jake, Garrett called after him, his voice smooth and calculated. You're in too deep, and I'm the only one who can help you get out. Jake paused in the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. Help me? You don't even know what you're offering. Oh, but I do, Garrett said, standing up. He adjusted his sunglasses, hiding whatever emotion lay beneath. I'm offering you a chance to turn things around, Jake. To stop running, to stop hiding, to finally get the upper hand in this game. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. He just stepped out the door, closing it softly behind him. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jake was done talking. Whatever Garrett was offering, whatever game he thought he could play, Jake wasn't interested. Not yet. He had his own plans, and he was going to make them work, with or without Garrett's help. Later that night, as they drove through the winding roads away from the motel, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Garrett was still watching them, that he hadn't seen the last of the man. Garrett's words echoed in his mind, twisting his thoughts. But Jake wasn't ready to make a deal with someone like Garrett. Not yet. Keanu was driving now, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but Jake could tell the tension hadn't lifted. Keanu had the same look in his eyes, watchful, wary. They both knew they were being hunted, but they also knew they weren't alone in this anymore. Who do you think he works for? Keanu asked, his voice low but urgent. Jake shook his head. I don't know, but I don't trust him. Keanu didn't respond immediately, but he glanced at Jake before turning back to the road. I agree, but we don't know how much longer we can keep running. Jake clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Keanu was right. They couldn't hide forever. They needed answers, and they needed to find them before it was too late. The night was quiet, but Jake could feel the storm brewing. His mind raced, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Keanu had been driving for hours, the headlights of the car cutting through the darkness like a knife through fog. The roads were empty, isolated, just the way they liked it, but it didn't bring Jake peace. He was restless, his thoughts locked on Garrett's cryptic words. I'm the only one who can help you get out. The words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. Was Garrett bluffing? Or was there truth in them? Jake wasn't the kind of guy to rely on anyone. He had always trusted himself above all else. But something about Garrett, his calm demeanor, the ease with which he spoke, told Jake that the man wasn't just anyone. They hadn't made it far from the motel, but it felt like they were in another world altogether. The city lights were now a distant memory, swallowed up by the wilderness surrounding them. The tires hummed against the asphalt, a steady rhythm that matched Jake's growing unease. Keanu's voice broke through the silence. You okay? Jake didn't respond immediately. He was staring out the window, watching the blur of trees and roadside signs flicker past. The question wasn't one of physical discomfort. Keanu knew that. It was about the weight of the unknown that pressed on Jake's chest, that gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I'm not sure, Jake finally muttered. I just can't shake the feeling that Garrett knows more than he's letting on. He's not just some random guy. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tight. You think he's connected to the people chasing us? Jake nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the passing darkness. I don't know, but whoever he works for, they're playing a much bigger game than we are. They both knew the stakes had just been raised, and with Garrett's involvement, Jake could sense that things were about to get a lot more complicated. Back at the motel, hours earlier, Garrett had watched them drive off. The same calm smile still lingered on his lips as he stood alone in the parking lot. His sunglasses were perched on his nose, hiding whatever emotion flickered beneath. But there was no mistaking it. He had made his move, and he was now waiting for Jake to decide whether or not he would take the bait. Garrett didn't rush things. He wasn't desperate. He was patient, and he knew that in the end, Jake would come around. Everyone did. Garrett had a way of making people see things his way. And Jake? He wasn't much different from the others. A new lead. The drive continued into the night, and the silence in the car grew thicker. Keanu could feel it too. They were nearing a crossroads, and it wasn't just about the next destination. Jake was running through scenarios in his head, weighing every option, and Keanu could tell his friend was closer to making a decision. The gravel crunching beneath the tires signaled that they were leaving the main road behind. Keanu pulled the car into a small, secluded area off the beaten path, one of those places where people rarely stopped. It was quiet. Too quiet. Jake turned to Keanu, his expression grim. "We're going to have to make a choice soon." Keanu nodded, though his eyes stayed on the road ahead. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew the reality of their situation. The people who had been after them, Billy's men, weren't going to give up, no matter how far they ran. And now, with Garrett in the picture, they had another player to consider. Someone who had already been pulling strings in the background. "We can't keep running forever," Keanu said, his voice steady, though the weight of their situation was clear in his tone. "But we don't have the luxury of jumping into whatever Garrett's offering either." Jake's jaw tightened. "No, we need to figure out what his endgame is first. If he's working with them, if he's part of the same network, then we can't trust him." Keanu looked over at Jake for a moment before pulling the car into a small parking lot. The place was almost abandoned, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp overhead. The tension between them was palpable. Jake turned to Keanu. "We'll lay low here for a bit. I need to think." "About Garrett?" Keanu asked, shifting in his seat. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a slow breath, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. "About everything." The first piece of the puzzle. Keanu and Jake stepped out of the car, stretching their legs after hours on the road. The cool night air hit their skin, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people left in the world. The silence was almost soothing, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. It never did. They hadn't gone far before a familiar sound reached their ears, the low hum of an engine. The sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through Jake's veins. He turned to Keanu, his face hardening. "Get ready," Jake muttered. They took cover behind the nearest building, crouching low as the vehicle approached. It was a black SUV, familiar, too familiar. Jake's pulse quickened as it came into view. This wasn't a coincidence. Garrett's black SUV. The vehicle pulled into the parking lot and stopped a few feet from where Jake and Keanu were hiding. Garrett stepped out, his ever-present calm demeanor intact. He wasn't surprised to see them. Not in the least. Jake and Keanu didn't move. They watched from their position as Garrett slowly approached, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. "You didn't think I'd let you go so easily, did you?" Garrett's voice was low, almost playful, like they were playing a game and he had already won. Jake's instincts flared. "What do you want?" Garrett smiled again, that same unnerving calm. "I want to make sure you don't make a mistake. You don't want to be enemies with me, Jake. Trust me, it's better this way." Keanu's hand instinctively hovered near the gun at his waist, but Jake put a hand on his arm to stop him. "You don't get it," Jake said, his voice firm. "You're not the one calling the shots here." Garrett's smile faltered for just a moment before he straightened, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that." Jake's heart pounded as Garrett turned his back and walked away, his confident strides telling Jake that Garrett was a man who wasn't used to losing. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake watched as Garrett walked away, his footsteps rhythmic and unbothered, like he had all the time in the world. Jake's instinct screamed at him to act, to make a move before Garrett got the upper hand. But he held himself back, weighing the consequences of each decision. Keanu's hand hovered near his waist, where his gun rested, but Jake's hand on his arm stopped him. They weren't out of options yet, not unless they made a rash move. "What's he playing at?" Keanu asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jake muttered, his eyes still trained on Garrett. "But whatever it is, I don't think we're going to like it." Keanu didn't say anything more, but the air between them crackled with a mixture of distrust and uncertainty. They were running out of time, running out of options, and Garrett wasn't helping matters. A risky proposition, Back in the SUV, Garrett waited with his arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable as he stared through the windshield. His patience had always been his greatest asset. He wasn't concerned with Jake's refusal. Not yet. He knew the man, and he knew how to play people like Jake. It had been a calculated move to show up here, to find them when they thought they were in the clear. Garrett wasn't here to make friends, but he did know that in this game, alliances could be as valuable as enemies. And Jake was someone who could prove useful. Jake, Keanu, Garrett muttered to himself, a slow smile spreading across his face. You'll come around. He leaned forward, opening the glove compartment, pulling out a phone. He dialed a number, waiting a moment before speaking. Do you have eyes on them? Garrett asked, his voice cool but sharp. A pause. Then a gravelly voice on the other end of the line. Yeah, they're here. And they've spotted you. They're not making any moves yet. Good, Garrett replied. But they'll have to make a choice soon enough. Keep watching them. I'll be in touch. He hung up, tossing the phone back into the glove compartment. The game was just beginning, and Garrett wasn't about to let Jake slip through his fingers. The decision. Jake and Keanu stayed hidden in the shadows, keeping their distance as Garrett's SUV finally pulled away. For a moment, there was silence, except for the sound of their own breathing and the distant hum of the wind. Jake's mind raced, still processing everything that had happened. This is getting worse, Keanu said, breaking the silence. We can't keep running. Not like this. Jake looked at him, his expression dark. I know, but we don't know what he's offering us, Keanu. We don't know if it's a trap. I get that, Keanu replied, rubbing the back of his neck. But we can't afford to just ignore him. If he knows something we don't, if he's got the connections to get us out of this mess. I don't trust him, Jake interrupted, his tone sharp. He paused, rubbing his temples in frustration. But I'm starting to think we don't have a choice. Keanu didn't push the matter any further. Jake was right. Every move they made seemed to close them in tighter, and Garrett wasn't backing down. Sooner or later, they were going to have to make a deal. The question was, which side would they be on when it all came crashing down? Unexpected visitors. Before Jake could make sense of everything running through his mind, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the tension. It was unmistakable. Another SUV. But this one wasn't Garrett's. Keanu's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively going to his weapon again. This doesn't feel right. Jake raised a hand, signaling him to stay put. The car slowed as it neared the parking lot, coming to a stop at the edge. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark clothing, their movements deliberate and precise. They didn't look like the usual troublemakers. These guys were organized. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They weren't here to play games. I've got a bad feeling about this, Keanu muttered, eyes scanning the men, sizing them up. I know, Jake replied, his voice low, but we can't afford to get caught. We need to move. Keanu didn't hesitate. He reached into the back seat, pulling out a few supplies, tools that might help them get out of sight if needed. He passed one to Jake, and the two of them slipped through the back of the building, making their way toward the rear exit. The men approached the SUV, but Jake and Keanu stayed out of sight, watching closely from behind the cover of an abandoned shed. The men looked around, as if searching for something or someone. This is bad, Keanu whispered, voice tight. Who are they looking for? I don't know, but I don't think they're looking for us, Jake replied, his eyes narrowing. I think they're after Garrett. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. If these men were after Garrett, that meant they weren't in the clear yet. They might have just walked into a bigger mess than they realized. A dangerous game. The two men began to move in the direction of Garrett's SUV, their posture rigid, eyes sharp as they surveyed the area. Jake and Keanu exchanged a quick glance. This was it. They had to make their move now, or they risked being caught in the crossfire. We need to go, Jake said, his voice low and urgent. Let's slip out of here before it gets ugly. Keanu nodded, and the two of them turned, making their way toward the trees lining the edge of the parking lot. Their steps were quiet, calculated. The last thing they needed was to draw attention. But as they neared the tree line, the sound of a car door slamming shut froze them in their tracks. They didn't need to look. They both knew what was coming. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They had to act fast. The air was thick with tension as Jake and Keanu crouched behind the trees, watching the two mysterious men approach. Every sound, every crack of a twig underfoot seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. They could hear the faint hum of the wind, the distant rattle of a loose sign in the parking lot, but the most pressing sound was the steady rhythm of their own breathing. Jake motioned for Keanu to stay still. He knew they didn't have much time. If they made a wrong move now, they were done. The men were getting closer, and their footsteps were getting louder with each passing second. Keanu's voice was barely a whisper. "We need to move, Jake. They're getting too close." "I know," Jake replied, his voice just as quiet but full of urgency. "But we can't be seen." The two men were just a few yards away now, their figures emerging into the dim light cast by the flickering street lamp. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the familiar adrenaline surge. This was no longer about running. It was about surviving. And the truth was, they couldn't afford to let these men get any closer. The moment they'd been waiting for arrived when one of the men turned away, momentarily distracted by a faint noise in the distance. That was Jake's chance. With a swift nod to Keanu, they made their move, slipping silently into the shadows. They darted through the trees, moving as fast as they could without making a sound. Keanu led the way, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of their path, while Jake stayed close, always looking over his shoulder. The two men, oblivious to their movements, began talking in hushed tones, likely unaware of how close their prey was. Jake and Keanu were almost at the edge of the parking lot when they heard the unmistakable sound of a car door opening, followed by the rumble of an engine starting. Keanu's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but Jake stopped him with a shake of his head. They couldn't afford to draw attention. A dangerous encounter. The SUV, the one Jake had recognized from before, revved its engine, pulling away from the parking lot with a sharp turn. The headlights illuminated the dark night as it sped off into the distance. But they weren't alone. The two men were now clearly in pursuit, their own vehicle starting up with a harsh growl of the engine. It took only a moment for Jake to realize what was happening. These men weren't here to ask questions. They were here to finish what they'd started. The chase was on. Keanu's plan. "We need to lose them," Keanu muttered as they both scrambled to find cover behind a nearby concrete wall. They were still hidden in the shadows, but the chase had just turned into a high-stakes game. "Head for the back roads. We'll make them think we're heading north, but we'll cut east instead." Jake nodded. He didn't have time to argue. They had one shot at this, and they couldn't afford to screw it up. Without wasting another moment, they sprinted in the direction Keanu had suggested, praying the men wouldn't spot them. The sound of engines roaring grew fainter as they rounded a corner and disappeared into a narrow side street. The alley was dimly lit by a single street lamp, and the scent of wet asphalt filled the air. Jake glanced over at Keanu. His friend's jaw was set, eyes determined. He knew this was their best chance to escape. "You take the lead," Jake said, trusting Keanu's instincts. "I'll cover you." Keanu nodded, his hand gripping the gun tightly as they crouched low and moved quickly through the maze of back streets. A shocking revelation. Just as they were beginning to feel like they had shaken their pursuers, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the quiet. Jake froze, his blood running cold. It wasn't his phone. It was Keanu's. Keanu pulled it from his pocket, his face unreadable. He glanced at the screen, then passed it to Jake. It was a message from an unknown number. The text was short, but the message was clear. "They're not after you. They're after Garrett. He's in more danger than you think." Jake's mind raced as he absorbed the message. What the hell did this mean? Were the two men after Garrett all along? Was Garrett part of something bigger than they had originally thought? Before Jake could ask, Keanu's phone buzzed again, this time with a new text. "Get to the bridge. If you want answers, it's your only shot." Jake looked at Keanu, who was now as confused as he was. "Bridge?" Keanu asked. "Which bridge?" "There's only one bridge around here," Jake said, his voice low. "The one off Route 25. That's where Garrett's message led us earlier. We need to go." Without another word, the two of them turned and sprinted toward the bridge. They didn't know who was pulling the strings now, or what the endgame was, but they knew one thing. They had to get to that bridge if they were going to survive this. The final showdown. As they approached the bridge, Jake's mind raced, his heart thumping in his chest. The dim glow of the headlights reflected off the water below, but there was no sign of Garrett's SUV. Had they made it in time? Had Garrett gotten out of there safely? Then, out of nowhere, a black figure emerged from the darkness ahead. It wasn't Garrett. It was one of the men who had been chasing them. Jake's pulse spiked as the figure drew closer, a gun in hand. He didn't hesitate. The moment the man raised the gun, Jake was already moving, his body honed by years of experience. A shot rang out, but it missed. Jake lunged forward, disarming the man in one swift motion. In the chaos of the moment, Keanu took the opportunity to grab the man's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground. "We need answers," Jake demanded, his voice cold and hard. "Who sent you?" The man didn't answer right away, his face twisted in a grimace. But finally, with a strained breath, he spoke. "You're not the ones who need answers," he said, a hint of desperation in his voice. "Garrett's the one you should be worried about." Before Jake could respond, the sound of a car engine revving filled the air. The unmistakable roar of Garrett's SUV cut through the night, and they turned to see it speeding toward them. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't over. But the moment Garrett's car came into view, he saw something else. Another figure, standing at the bridge's edge. It was Garrett. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief as Garrett stepped forward, looking calm and composed, like he had everything under control. "I told you," Garrett said, his voice smooth and unwavering. "I always have a plan."